So today I wanted to talk about the 5 best books that I read in 2021. So starting with number 5 is Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. And so this is a book about a woman named Eleanor who is fine. She has her day-to-day routine. She goes to her office. She does her work. She doesn't really much talk to her coworkers. She goes home. She hangs out by herself. She spends all of her weekends the exact same way. And that's fine. That's exactly how she likes it. She is completely fine. And so she ends up helping this man who has fallen on the street, and her and one of her coworkers end up bringing him to the hospital. And this event, I guess, catalyzes a bond to start to form between her and her coworker, as well as her as the man that her and her coworker had helped. And she kind of meets his family. And all of this starts to bring her out of her shell of her very isolated routine that she has developed. And as a character, she is very socially awkward because of events in her childhood that do get explored in this book. But what I really loved about this book and why it made it onto my top 5 list is that I think it explores what it means to be just fine versus what it means to actually be good, to live your life and to say, nothing's wrong, I'm fine. Even though maybe you don't have anything fulfilling or motivating you to live your day-to-day life, versus what it means to actually be good and to have a life worth living and a life that you enjoy. And this book is funny, it's hilarious. So you see everything through Eleanor's point of view. And as I mentioned, she is very socially awkward. And so you'll see totally normal interactions that you would read, and if you were in the other person's perspective, it would be a totally normal interaction. But Eleanor just doesn't see it as normal. Like, she'll be thinking, like, why are they talking to me? Why are they, like, doing this? This is so, like, whatever. And so the way it's written, it's funny in a kind of, like, dry humor way. And it's sad, I think. It gets to a very dark place a little bit in the middle of the book. And when it gets to that dark place, it is very, very sad. But at the core of it, this book is so uplifting. It talks, like, it tells you, or it gives you the message that your life is made meaningful by the connections that you have. And I think it was just so, despite it being sad at the parts that were very sad, and some of it was also very realistic and very hard to read. But at the end of the day, I think it was still so hopeful and so uplifting that I loved it. I cried reading it. And I also think that one thing that I especially appreciated about this was that they focus on more of a social relationship. Like, they do kind of explore a potential for a romantic relationship, but that's not the focus of this book. The focus is on the social relationships that she makes and the platonic relationships that she makes, and how those transform her from being completely fine versus being good and being great and having a life that she wakes up every day looking forward to. And I really like that, because I find a lot of the time it seems that romantic relationships are focused on as, like, a be-all end-all. And this book showed us that that's not what you need to have a life that you enjoy living. It's the social connections and the people around you, and how you see yourself in like, how you see your place in this world in relation to the people around you and the connections that you've made. And it was just really beautiful. So number 4 is Mexican Gothic. And this is a story about a woman named Noemi. I think I might be saying that wrong. Noemi. And so Noemi's father receives a message from her cousin that is quite troubling, and her father is very worried about her cousin's mental state. So he sends Noemi out to check on her cousin in the mansion where she lives with her husband and her husband's family. And so this mansion is quite isolated. It's like a significant drive out of, like, an already small isolated town. And so Noemi gets there, and it is large and old and, like, dusty, and the only people there are her cousin and her cousin's husband and his family. And when she speaks to her cousin, you could tell like very obviously that something is wrong, and the family won't really let her talk to her cousin. They're like, they limit the interactions that she can have with her, and they're always like, okay, she's tired, she needs to sleep, she's sick, okay, take time for you to go now, and usher her back to her own room. And Noemi is trying to get her cousin to see her own doctor, her own psychiatrist, and the family is refusing. And so Noemi is kind of forced to stay there because she doesn't want to like let down her dad and leave without her cousin. And it's also kind of starting to become apparent that even if she wants to leave, the family who owns the mansion is probably not going to let her. And so this book was a bit of a slow burn for the first 2/3, but it was very atmospheric with that feeling that something is wrong, something is off, something is definitely very creepy, but you don't know what it is. And yet that, even though it was slow, it was compelling because I wanted to know what was going on with this house, what was going on with this family. Why wouldn't they let her see her cousin? Why is her cousin acting so weird? And it just, ooh, I think it paid off very well. The last third was a lot faster paced than the slow burn, but once you kind of start finding out what's happening and the pieces are all coming together, it starts going very fast. I wouldn't necessarily say it's scary, but it does have that atmospheric dread that I personally really love. And it also had, I'm not going to spoil, but the horror element, like the everything that was behind everything. Does that make sense? Just, the element of horror was so unexpected, and I guess is a genre of horror that I never even really thought existed, I guess. But it took me by surprise, and I really loved it, and I would really love to read more books that are similar. As I said, it was very unexpected, and once I kind of started finding out what was going on, I was so compelled to just finish the story and like figure out like how it was going to end, how everything's going to play out, that I stayed up to finish it. I completely lost track of time. I remember checking the time being like, oh, it's probably like midnight, I need to go to bed, and it was 1:30. And so aside from the atmosphere, that slow building feeling of dread that something is wrong, I also really wanted to talk about the character work, specifically Noemi, because I really, really, really liked how feminine she was, because I think a lot of the time, at least in the type of books that I read, which is a lot of fantasy, a lot of the main female characters we have are very typically not like other girls, and I cannot stand that trope. And so we have Noemi, who is she's a debutante. Like she likes to go to parties, and she's very into fashion and dating and, like buying new outfits and stuff like that. Stuff that's like seen as like typically like quote unquote girly. And she is into all of that, and she is very feminine, and yet she is still resourceful, and she's still strong, and she's still a great protagonist. And so I loved her. I loved reading about her, and I also just loved that in general, that I feel like we finally have a strong character who's strong and feminine and female, and it's not, she's strong despite being feminine. So, okay. So number 3 is, I'm having a hard time deciding between The Shadow Rising and The Fires of Heaven, which are books 4 and 5 of Wheel of Time. I like both of them so much. I think I'm gonna go with The Fires of Heaven, because that one shocked me a lot. A lot of things happened in that one that I didn't expect. But I'm kind of gonna also talk about Wheel of Time as a whole, because I read the first 6 books this year. So Wheel of Time is a epic fantasy series that tells the story of a man named Randall Thor, who is a farm boy turned chosen one, which is, a very common classic fantasy trope, and I don't mind that. I love that. I grew up playing Legend of Zelda. I love reading about farm boys who go on to become heroes. But it's really interesting because that chosen one trope has a bit of a twist, where he is destined to save the world, but he's also destined to break the world, and so he will save the world, and in doing so he will destroy the world, and he will also die himself, is in the prophecy, I believe. And I think that gives a really interesting twist to that typical like chosen one arc or trope. And so he is in a world where there's this magic source, and typically only women are able to use it, because men that can use it end up going mad. and they are hunted down and murdered. And so Rand, the chosen one, is a man who is able to channel, so he's able to use magic in this world. And so we also see that he's got this like coming madness that he needs to stave off, but he also needs to be, you know, sane enough and powerful enough, so he needs access to magic in order to defeat the Dark One in like the big battle. And so this is a really, really great series. It's such a good like classic fantasy adventure. I feel like every time I open a book and I read that opening passage about, you know, like it was like the wind was not a beginning, there are neither beginnings nor endings to the turnings of the wheel of time. It's just so nostalgic. It reminds me of being a kid and staying up way too late probably reading about like adventure fantasy, or like we're being a kid and playing Zelda or playing Final Fantasy and like having just this like wistfulness that I wish that I was in those worlds. And so reading this series is scratching that itch for me. And it's a great series. I think it's got really great characters. I know maybe I might be alone in that opinion. No, I know I'm not alone, but I think I have heard a lot of people complain about the characters, especially the women, which I personally, I enjoy them all. I'm playing D&D right now with some friends, and I named my character Egwene Elvira after Egwene. And so Robert Jordan, I also think, does a very, very good job with his POV characters, where not even just POV, but like other characters. Like I feel like his characters are very fleshed out, where I never feel like I never feel like I read about characters doing something that seem out of character. Like they will do something, and even if I'm like, that's a stupid decision, it seems right. It seems like that is something that that character would do. And I really appreciate that. And even in reading all their different POVs, and there are a lot of POV characters, they all feel different. They all feel like they have their own voice. The way they think is all different. You can tell that there is a lot of like work put into these characters, and it doesn't feel like it's just one author writing a bunch of different characters. It feels like I'm actually reading from the perspective of a bunch of different people, and I really love that. And I liked the Shadow Rising and the Fires of Heaven. I'm just combining them now. I liked those two the most. I think they were the most fast-paced, and the first 3 books almost feel like setup as to like now getting the actual ball rolling with what's happening with the main story. And we also have the introduction to some of my favorite characters in book 4. I think actually book 3, but we get to spend more time with them in book 4, and that would be the Aiel, specifically Avienda. And these 2 books, book 4 and book 5, chef's kiss, phenomenal. I loved them. What else? And so number 2 is the 10,000 Doors of January, and this is a urban fantasy / portal fantasy about a young girl named January who lives with her father, and then both her and her father were taken in by this man named Mr. Locke. But her father isn't around very much, so she mainly just spends most of her time with Mr. Locke and his servants, I guess, housekeepers, and the rich people that he associates with. And so January is able to open doors to other worlds. And so one day she finds this diary in Mr. Locke's house, and it's kind of detailing the adventures of someone else's journey into these other worlds. And I'm not going to say anything else from there because I don't want to get into spoilers, because I think this is something that you should experience for yourself. But I will say that I really liked the way that this was presented with the dual narrative. So we see January's story, and then we also are reading the diary entries from the journal that she found. And so we're getting that story unfold as well, kind of at the same time. And they end up being intertwined in a way, and it's just so beautiful. This book was heartbreaking and heart-wrenching, but also so heartwarming and so beautiful. And I think it just perfectly captured this feeling of like wanderlust and wistfulness and like longing to go somewhere but being unable to go. Like me reading about fantasy and wishing that I could go to those worlds and being unable to. Oh, it is fantastic, and the story is quite unpredictable. I mean, there were some things that I definitely was able to predict, but all in all, like, there were things that were definitely like didn't go into the way that I expected. And it's just, and the writing for this as well is just so beautiful. I think that the author does have a kind of flowery, I guess, way with words, and I find that sometimes that maybe puts me off of reading too much. But I think that she did it really well. I really liked the prose. I thought that the writing of this was absolutely beautiful, and it made me feel so many emotions. It made me feel such a sense of wonder at the same time, mixed with such a sense of longing, and it was just phenomenal. And I loved the characters in this as well. I thought that January was so strong and so resilient and headstrong. And I don't want to go into spoilers, but the other characters I thought were all really well written as well. And there were so many emotions that I felt while reading this. It truly was a beautiful, beautiful book. And there were also some, as I said, like some things that I really didn't expect. So there are a lot of like pretty heavy themes that ended up being touched on in this book, like themes of like objectification, and again, I don't want to get into spoilers, but it ended up, like I said, it ended up going somewhere where I didn't quite expect, and the way everything turned out was just amazing, phenomenal, heart stopping, show stopping, whatever. Okay, so number one now is One Piece. Specifically, I'm going to say Alabasta, because I don't just want to say all of One Piece, but I had previously watched, I guess, One Piece many years ago, and I'd been talking about it pretty recently with a friend of mine, and I like was talking about it for like probably 2 hours nonstop, and I was just getting this like longing of like, man, I've been meaning to catch up for so many years, and I should really just do it. But since it's been so many years since I watched it, I was like, okay, I'm gonna just start from the beginning. And so I started reading from the beginning. So it's my first time going through the manga. I'd previously made it only up to like halfway through Punk Hazard. And so last year in 2021, I read up to Long Ring Long Island, and then I switched to watching for Water 7, and then that's where I am right now, just because Water 7 is so emotional, and I was like, oh, and like Annie's Lobby, I'm including them together. But I wanted the voice acting and music, and then I'm probably going to switch back to reading after. But anyways, so One Piece, if you don't know, is a manga / anime about a group of pirates that are sailing the world together in search of this treasure called the One Piece. And at its core, the biggest thing about One Piece that I love so much is I think it is the hands down the best example of found family that I have ever read or watched. I think it might be the only found family that I've ever read. But even saying that, I feel like I can still confidently say that it's the best, because nothing else gives me that feeling of like, here is a group of people who would die for each other. And it's just so wonderful to read about. It makes me feel like I'm there with them, and I'm also part of this crew. And so this crew, they sail around, and they kind of, they sail from island to island. And there's something that I really enjoy about the pirate style and like the world of One Piece is that, because I've watched most of Naruto Shippuden, and I watched like some of Bleach and some of My Hero Academia, so I've seen other like long-running shonens before, and something that I really liked and appreciated about the world of One Piece is that idea of like sailing from island to island gives Oda so much creative freedom to do whatever he wants, because each island kind of has a different theme and a different story, and it's like a different like villain and a different, just an entire arc. And so it literally feels like each island could have been like its own anime story, but instead we get it with these group of people who, the more that we spend time with them, the more that we grow to love them. And having all of this long standing manga gives you so much time, or gives the author so much time to like properly develop these characters into people that you really truly love. And I truly do. They're just, the crew is just amazing, and the world that Oda has built is just, it feels so alive. And because I have seen up to where I have seen, I know that, you know, a lot of the things that I'm about to touch on do get explored later, but up to from where I am right now in the manga, um, or up to where I am right now in the anime at Water 7, Enies Lobby is technically where I'm at. Um, there's just so much that like kind of gets introduced to you and you're like, oh, I don't know, is that going to be important? And then you kind of get fed like a little bit more and more, and then it just like makes you want to know more about this huge world with this like massive lore that Oda has created. Like seriously, I feel like he could rival Tolkien. Maybe not. Maybe. I don't know. But like, you know, you first you learn about the Marines, and then, you know, you're first introduced to them through, you know, this like laughable guy. But as you go on through the story and you meet more, you start to meet some who are like seriously powerful and seriously scary. And then you're starting to learn about all these like world, like organizations. Like you have like the 7 warlords who rule the sea. And you're like, you hear about those and you're like, dang, I really want to learn more about that. And then you do. And you hear about the, you know, like the fleet admirals in the Marines. And you're like, oh, like I want to know more about those guys. And then you do. And it's just, there's just so many elements that come together, and there is also so much, like, you can tell that Oda has put so much love and like effort into maintaining this story. And I said I was going to talk about Alabasta and not just all of what I've read so far of One Piece. And so I will. And so the reason I'm choosing Alabasta as my favorite of what I've read, from this year, I would say that Water 7 is, or from 2021, I would say that Water 7 is definitely my favorite, but since I watched it and not reading it, I didn't read it, I'm not technically counting that. So anyways, so Alabasta, I really loved the villain in Alabasta. I really loved how in East Blue, and again, I'm going to try not to get into spoilers, but I really loved how in East Blue, the original arc, you know, Luffy, he does definitely kind of have trouble taking down like the main antagonists of each arc, but it doesn't necessarily, like, it's not as bad as it is until he gets to the Grand Line and that first island on the Grand Line. And then you see like what a Grand Line villain really is truly like with the first villain of, or the, like, with the villain of Alabasta, sorry. And there's also one of my favorite characters who is an honorary crewmate, Vivi. I love her. She's absolutely amazing. She's funny, she's sweet, she's strong, and she's resilient. I feel like I've used that word 3 times already. But she's just amazing. And if we're including like the Alabasta, the umbrella term, to include also Drum Island, then we get the introduction of my favorite crew member. It's just, it's phenomenal. I thought that, like, out of the arcs that I read, like, the story was my favorite, and I also found that Luffy's use of defeating, like, the antagonist was the most creative, and just seeing that, like, the lengths that he would go to, it felt a little bit more impactful to me, because in Alabasta, he was more, like, his motivations were more about like loyalty and like protecting someone that he cared about, versus in Skypiea where it was just like, okay, well, we're gonna get filthy rich and get all this gold. And then East Blue, which is good. I mean, Arlong was fantastic, phenomenal, but it's not on the level of any of the Grand Line arcs. And so anyways, I've rambled on enough about One Piece and Alabasta. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks, bye!